During a sad and tragic funeral of a beloved woman who loved animals, her favorite horse appeared to pay her final respects. However, it jumped onto the casket. What happened next is incredible. In Mexico, there was a woman called Teresa. She was like any normal woman, happy, healthy, and content in life. She loved her family very much. Teresa had grown up on a family farm, and as such, she revered nature and animals. The family raised horses on the farm. Teresa's father had learned the craft from his parents. The love for horses ran in her blood, just like it had for generations in her family. The truth was that Teresa had a passion for horses. She loved everything about them, how powerful, big and impressive they looked, and how incredibly gentle and affectionate they were despite their size. It was as if Teresa had a preference for horses that grew and developed over time. Eventually, she became the main expert on horses on the farm, a role she naturally and perfectly fulfilled. If there was such a thing as a perfect job for Teresa, it was that. Although she had her favorite horse, King, the biggest stallion on the farm, who was much larger and prouder than all of the other horses, she hadn't always been that way. When he was born, everyone was concerned that King wouldn't survive, as he was born with health problems. That meant many things that were taken for granted by other horses were not easy for him. His condition was not a death sentence per se, but life would be tough for the poor animal. Luckily, Teresa was there to help King. She had compassion for the horse and did her best to nurse him back to health. She fed him multiple times a day, brushed and groomed him. She took him to the fields so he could run around in the sun, and even put a blanket over him and cuddled up to him when it was cold outside. Teresa protected and loved King as if he were her own child. While it started as a close friendship, the relationship between Teresa and King developed into a bond of unconditional love and respect. As King grew up, he saw Teresa as his mother, who essentially raised him from birth and ensured his survival when everyone else thought he would die. Teresa did have a life outside of work actually. She lived in a small town where she had some friends, including a few men who often competed for her affection because she was so occupied with the horses. However, Teresa never seemed to have time for a relationship. When King was nursed back to health, she thought it might be time to start a relationship with one of the men vying for her affection. The man vying for Teresa's love was named Thomas. He was wealthy and extremely good looking, but he was very pretentious and lacked depth or charisma. He tried to woo her by talking about himself or splurging money. Although his good looks were undeniable, Teresa had never shown any romantic interest in him and found his personality off-putting and unattractive. On the other hand, the other man vying for Teresa's love was a man named Elijah. He was humble, hardworking, and had grown up on a farm, working since Teresa had known him from childhood. But he lacked confidence and never thought he was good enough. Perhaps his shyness stemmed from his financial and social status, but he often felt unworthy of Teresa. Then they grew closer and fell in love with each other. Everyone was happy and excited for them except for one person, Thomas. Thomas was furious. Why would Teresa choose a stable boy over a wealthy and successful man? He was so angry that he actively tried to separate them. He whispered lies about Teresa into Elijah's ears and belittled his rival's achievements in front of her to make him look bad. The lovebirds saw through his plan and reassured each other of their love and devotion. Thanks to Teresa's unwavering support, Elijah became more confident and open, while she finally knew what it meant to be loved by a caring, selfless man. They couldn't have been happier, but their domestic bliss was painful for Thomas, and when they announced their intention to marry, he simply lost his mind. Then things took a dramatic turn as Thomas' malice reached a new level. One day, when Teresa was dining alone in a cafe and briefly went to the restroom, he sneaked a strange substance into her food. Thomas had just left the table as Teresa devoured her meal, unaware that it was poisoned. She had caught sight of him a few tables away, but carefully turned her head in the opposite direction to avoid his gaze. This disregard for him only infuriated him more. So he decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one could. He had planned to administer the antidote and play the hero. But when he saw Teresa conversing with a friend about their upcoming wedding, he decided to let fate take care of her. Later that day, she started feeling sick, but she attributed her illness to the weather. It was particularly cold outside, so she might have caught something. But later in the night, she passed out, and Elijah discovered her when he came home from work. When he rushed her to the nearby hospital, she was paralyzed, and the doctors couldn't detect a pulse on Teresa. The technology at the hospital was rudimentary, as it was not located in a wealthy and prosperous part of Mexico. The doctors tried several things, but there was nothing they could do. Teresa was pronounced dead only half an hour after Elijah carried her through the hospital. Devastated, he went to King, the horse he often visited with Teresa. He went to the stable and wept before him, releasing his emotions. King looked at Elijah with a strange seriousness in his eyes, as if he understood that Teresa would not return and that he would never see her again. Elijah stopped speaking and King slumped down. It was truly a dark day. The day of Teresa's funeral arrived and many people attended the service. It was a close-knit community and everyone knew Teresa, if not personally, then at least in passing. But there was an unusual mourner present, King. Elijah knew how much the horse meant to his beloved fiancée, and it was only fitting to let him come and bid farewell. Before the service began and people were still quietly conversing, the horse approached Teresa's casket and sniffed it thoroughly. But then it did something no one had expected. King reared up on his hind legs and landed with his front legs on the wood, as if he was trying to climb up on the casket or join Teresa inside. Some people screamed as everyone watched in shock as King repeatedly struck the wood with his hooves, as if he was trying to communicate something no one understood. Suddenly, the casket broke open. The weight of the horse had been too much for it, but that's not the incredible part. People saw that Teresa was still alive. She looked around in confusion. She could barely move and her voice was only a whisper, but she was alive. Elijah's heart leaped as he saw his beloved was still with him. But there was one final shocking twist to the story. Teresa slowly lifted her arm and pointed into the crowd, and the heads of the people turned to Thomas, whom she indicated. The man couldn't hide his guilt as Teresa weakly explained what she strongly suspected. The police were immediately called and Thomas was taken to the station where he confessed everything. There was no denying it. Teresa embraced Elijah before turning to King, her proud and mighty horse. He had saved her life. Teresa smiled as she caressed him. Horses are truly incredible animals, and she had the most amazing one of all.